Howdy of you delicious people. So, reasonably, here's the thing. Immediately I should have tried to get this episode out to get reviewed and stuff like that. But ultimately, after watching this episode, I had completely forgotten that I had watched this episode. That's how really vital and or relevant this episode really was, to be brutally honest. So I want to talk about this episode as a bulk of filler of what it really was. Speaking of filler, it seems that all of a sudden, Billquist all of a sudden has more of a anime like approach to it. Fault me if you guys know a lot of anime, and especially if you end up having to forcibly watch an anime that has to be bizarrely censored, where all of a sudden they have these weird like white lights or white like lines over a person's body to especially cover up some kind of de-dressing or declothing at some point. Now all of a sudden in this show, bizarrely, we have like I don't know if it was just the variation of which that I was watching, or maybe everyone was watching this, but I thought it was so absurd that all of a sudden we now have this blurry effect that was kind of going on during this episode, and I just thought that that was absurd. I reasonably do not care at this point if it's like, well, that's because so and so person is now so and so thing, and I guess we had to do this now. I don't care. When looking at it, I'm like, reasonably, you guys didn't exactly cover up enough. Like, what was there some kind of pay disagreement? Was there some kind of like what was the issue? Because why is there all of a sudden a blur effect that is going on which wasn't there before? Unless I had seen something that wasn't there before. But anyways, so this episode is quite honestly and truly utterly irrelevant. It's just filler. If anything, some of the characters that I saw in this episode, I'm like, okay, so these are characters that are just shoved in here just to probably get taken away. Or quite honestly, just be characters that honestly and truly just really just go nowhere. If they were to add anybody. Like, God, there is so many people that I feel like they just keep adding for the sake of adding just to have them be irrelevant. I'm like, God, what, if ultimately, if you had seen the very last episode, ultimately, you'll have known that ultimately Odin has a fiance, and man, has just Shadow Moon's just thought process on Odin has just completely changed. And like I just thought that that was so fascinating to me how really like Yavator Shadow Moon is living to was living to just die by the sword of Odin, and now ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon is much more like, you know what, yeah, like I don't know what side I'm on anymore. Like it kind of feels like Shadow Moon is just out for Shadow Moon, and ultimately we have it to where uh, Shadow Moon is now living in some apartment of sorts, and really we get a whole backstory on that, and the person that he's ultimately uh, renting out this space for. Like, wow, this episode is just so impressive to me. Like I was just godsmacked about how like irrelevant this episode was. Like I'm like, so they teased a bunch of crazy stuff happening at the tail end of the first episode, to do basically absolutely nothing with any of that in this episode. I'm like, dude, so like they killed people off, they changed people to ultimately just go, yeah, we'll get back to that eventually, like probably like 5 to 8 episodes down the road on the next season if we get to that far. Because I don't know, like recently I think that these episodes so far are just leaving people disappointed. I did like the fact that they ended up having Chad Mulligan or ultimately Eric Johnson seemingly having a more prominent role in this episode for a little bit. Because ultimately, I just like Eric Johnson, ultimately the guy who had played in a live action variation of a show, Flash Gordon. He was also Whitney in Smallville. And ultimately, I was really happy that, like, I'm like, is he just going to be like one of those guys that is just on this show, but he's not really going to do anything? I'm like, because ultimately we just kind of see like a little bit of him in the first episode where ultimately he's eventually driving Shadow Moon to where he needs to go. But ultimately, like, he actually really legitimately has some kind of lines in this episode, which I'm like, okay, great. So at least they're not wasting this character to just be like, hey, he's gonna be on camera, and that's pretty much it. So let's ultimately just kind of just carve out this episode and call it a day, because there is not much to say about this show in this episode. There really is still like a complete and utter like, oh, there's a war going on kind of thing in this episode. You wouldn't know there's a war going on in this episode. You wouldn't know. You would have thought that like every single little weak moment, like the enemy would go out and just try to annihilate somebody at their weakest point. Like you would think, especially like the way of which this episode could have gone out, like the enemy could have caught somebody off guard and tried to kill them, and it's to make this a more interesting episode. But instead, it's like, oh no, we'll just like any Miss World and all their people. Yeah, we'll just have them take the day off again. Man, like, and nobody is adding to their numbers really all that. Like, man, I remember before when it'd just be like, man, it just seems like a call to arms for this whole thing, and now it's just like, well, hey, when we lose like 20 people, what are we gonna do? Well, I think we might maybe add a person, but that's just a maybe. Man, like, is there no one left to call already in 3 seasons deep? Is there nobody to call upon to be a part of this war? Good God. We're just kind of scraping at the bottom of the barrel already to have these characters, but I don't know. I didn't read the book, so when looking at it reasonably, I could be really and utterly, truly just really talking about this stuff, and it's like, oh, well, that's exactly how the book goes, or whatever. Like that's exactly this and that. Like, I don't know. I just thought that this episode just felt like cheap to me. It just felt like really cheap. And then also, I didn't quite understand how Stars now has to censor things. I'm very just. I was like, this is absurd. Because ultimately, what this woman still has, this person still has amazingly hot body, but all of a sudden now we just have to all of a sudden have blurring effects. Whatever. She still looks great. She does. Anyways, let's go into the double five time count after that amount of time. We're going to spoil this show because, people really need to hear about this one. This episode that had nothing to do with anything, and it was just like, man, if we are bringing that milk canister out and just slowly pouring it out, then this is it. So we ultimately have to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about time again to spoil the show. So the two characters that we have in this episode are Tyre or Tyrell, and ultimately Bill Sanders or William Huntington Sanders. Man, do those characters just seemingly are just scraping out of the bottom of the barrel to find an actor that can do this show, seemingly. And ultimately, we have Bill, who quickly just becomes just this, like, okay, well, he's with Bilquist, so in other words, I don't need to I don't need to care about this character if he's gonna be tied to Bilquist. Isn't this great? So this entire episode has to rest upon a funeral, which is the most boringest procedural thing in a show. And it's not even to the interesting part where you have to actually put the person in the grave or whatever. No. They're just having a wake for Zoria. And I was like, oh my god. So is the next episode going to be burying Zoria, and then they're gonna have a whole thing about that? So that way they could just stretch out these things more. Because if anything in season 2, man, did they have real troubles wanting to get out of the comfort of their not having to write anything. Now in this season, I'm wondering if they're going to stretch stuff out even more, just because they just don't want to write anything. They left all the writing to Orlando Jordan, who ultimately was Mr. Nancy, who they ultimately fired. So that's just absurd. So going on into this show, we have it to where Tyrell ultimately is probably the most interesting thing going on in this episode. We have a dentist who is a warlord of sorts, or a war god of sorts. And so ultimately, as per usual, we have Odin ultimately going, da, 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 let's make my way to this dentist person that ultimately just likes to pull people's teeth. And let's ultimately see where his head's at, or maybe his teeth. So we ultimately have to our seemingly we have Tyrell, who seems to have a prosthetic hand of sorts, and I thought that was the most interesting thing about this character. Just okay, so this guy's a dentist, but he has a prosthetic hand. Interesting. So recently, Tyrell is ultimately popping on a tooth of some kid, and I really like this image of actually showing the dentist coming out of this person's mouth, because ultimately when looking at it, I'm like, yeah, I like this imagery, because when looking at it, I'm like, how very rare do we have this kind of image done? Unless it's actually a dentist movie, because normally if anybody were to play a dentist, they would take the easy shot. So, but yeah, I just thought that this shot was just fascinating. So, we have it to where Odin comes a calling to Tyrell, and ultimately, Odin is trying to bargain and sway this war god of sorts, and it seems quite honestly, that Tyrell is just ultimately looking at Odin. Is like, hey, how's your teeth? And Odin's like, yeah, you're not gonna you're not gonna get any of these chompers. dear sir. And he's like, nah, well, at least I tried. So that is really just the extent of this person, really and truly and honestly. So we ultimately have Bilquist back into fray, and ultimately I'm quite just baffled why all of a sudden they have censorship on this woman. Could it possibly be that she might be pregnant now, and maybe that might be a reason for the censorship? Because if she's not pregnant, then like she still has a lovely body. She does. Um, maybe there's just some sensitivity, or maybe there's just some like, hey, they're not paying me enough to fully fledgedly 100% and in all frames show this beautiful bought off. So you know what? How about you just blur me out now? We ultimately have Sanders ultimately talking to Bilquist, and I'm like, okay, I really don't understand what this dialogue is about. And then ultimately, once uh, Bilquist does what she does best, then ultimately I'm like, well, this person just became another irrelevant character, Bill Sanders. But recently we have it to where Bilquist is talking to Bill, and ultimately he is like saying how why isn't it about time for Bilquist to get upgraded? And otherwise meaning like, man, I can't wait for you to just get recasted as someone else, like everyone else does. Um, and ultimately, we have it to where Bilquist is still like playing both sides, both fences, and because ultimately she is the god of fertility. And when looking at it, Technical Boy had kind of uh, gotten her out of the shadows. So ultimately, that's hence why, justifiably, she's kind of still playing the defensive things. So we have it to where Bill is ultimately like talking to Bilquist and basically mentioning like, "Hey man, like I can really help you. Like I have the technical prowess of being able to really benefit you and benefit whatever side you're going to be on, and so on and so forth." And so ultimately, we eventually have it as per usual when Bilquist, let's just say, wants somebody. We now have to have just uh, Bill ultimately just to be uh, thrown on a bed, ultimately to be consumed by Bilquist in a blurry yet uh, interesting, bizarrish. Because the bizarre thing comes after this. So they ultimately have it to where Bilquist just sucks a man down her rabbit hole, let's just say, and and but this time around, here's the weird thing that I'm just kind of like, huh, about. So we ultimately have Bilquist that ultimately, after she consumes a man, she ends up doing a little Ralph after that. She ends up doing a little barfing. She ends up doing a little afterwards. I'm like, so wait, is Bilquist pregnant, or uh, is she getting sick from all these mass consuming people? Was it just Bill that ultimately was didn't quite come in quite ripe, if you know what I mean? What is going on with again the Blur show? But also, why is all of a sudden Bill Quist doing a old Ralph Nader over off to the side there? Is kind of like, hopefully this person ultimately is not going to all of a sudden be like, yeah, let's recast this person now, cause because if they're foreshadowing that this girl is gonna get upgraded or going to be a new god or whatever, like, you know what? I think I'm just kind of just like, I am just gonna be utterly upset with this show. And if it's just gonna be eventually where we're just gonna have every single god just eventually just get recasted so they can just save on money, I am just going to be just I'm just going to be insulted. My intelligence is going to be insulted. And to just keep recasting people because this show is just burning money like it's no one's business. And I think the Blur show might have some ties to otherwise the money that is really just going on into this show now, where it's all of a sudden like they're trying to cut corners or they're trying to cut something or they're and I'm just baffled by the show. So we ultimately have it within here that ultimately so we have to really just tie in Shadow Moon because we already gotten rid of the two new people that are in these episodes that ended up going and gone basically at some point in this episode. So Shadow Moon. We're ultimately having Shadow Moon going to Zoria's funeral, where of course we have Odin showing up to talk to uh, Shenazbog. Shenazbog. I'm going to mispronounce that, and that's completely okay because at the end of the day, uh, he's a character that may show up every once in a while. Um, so we ultimately have Shanazbog that ultimately is just kind of throwing his hammer around and ultimately just he's hating on the fact that some people end up crashing his wake for Zoria. We have it to where Odin shows up and he wasn't invited. We have it to where there's a ton of people that show up and they were uninvited. Eventually, we have it to where Odin and Salim are ultimately having a disagreement because reasonably, we have it to where the Jinn ultimately had left Odin's side, and so Salim is just like, "Where's my Jinn? Get him back for me!" And Odin's just like, "Nah, like he went and did his own thing. So what?" And you ultimately have it to where by the end of this, you ultimately have Selene who ends up spitting on Odin and then walking off. I'm like, what is Salim going to be yet another person that is going to go out of his way to join up with Laura if Laura ever becomes alive again and try to kill Odin? Is he going to conspire against Odin like everyone else tried to do, but they're probably just going to end up dying anyways? So we end up having Sheka's Bog. I'm just gonna call him Shex or Bog for short. So we ultimately have Bog with the Bog, the bag, dicky, 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 said the dookie, said up, juck the boogie. We have that guy who is throwing his hammer around, and ultimately he ends up fighting Odin in this sphere, in this wake, and we have them fight out, but it's just in fun because they're both getting really, really drunk, and then they're fighting, and then they ultimately hug afterwards. And I'm like, so this is just like I'm thinking that everyone at this point is just gonna turn on Odin and kill him off, and then like, is everybody just gonna turn on Miss World and Odin and just kill them both off so they could just like live in peace? Is that gonna be the thing? Uh, or just have Odin do his Odin sleep and then just be like, oh, okay, well, because when is he gonna sleep at some point? He took a little nap, but that was not nothing like the Odin sleep, and that just helped us do a story of Odin. So we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is to be at this wake, and we have it towards the very tail end of this episode. And I'll get to Shadow Moon's more prominent story in this thing, because this is kind of like a little quick note here. So, you ultimately have Shadow Moon that is reasonably going in and like seeing kind of the dissension consistently within the ranks. I think Shadow Moon is just kind of done with being like any part of Odin whatsoever, because ultimately we had it to where Shadow Moon ultimately heard that Odin is basically his dada, and that ultimately we are starting to see, especially in this episode, that I am assuming that Shadow Moon could quite possibly be the new god of weather or whatever, the god of weather of sorts, because ultimately we have it showing in the very beginning of this that ultimately there is there are these guys that otherwise are just laying waste to Native Americans, and then ultimately after that they end up sacrificing someone to the god of weather, and I thought that visual was just fascinating. And then we ultimately had seemingly had Shadow Moon ultimately going to the grocery store with his mom, and all of a sudden we ultimately have to where Shadow Moon turns to ultimately see some god of sorts that is ultimately talking to him. And I'm just to assess that ultimately that was his actual mother, that ultimately was the either that or whoever was the previous god of weather. I'm assessing and or assuming, and I'm not quite understanding exactly what this white buffalo thing is to present with the fire that ultimately is coming out of the eyes. I'm really quite baffled and or confused what the heck that is. Like, is that to be a symbol for something? Is that some kind of thing that at some point Shadow Moon is going to ride off into the sunset with or something? Is like is that Shadow Moon's like Falcor, like from like Never Ending Story? Is that gonna be his like Falcor where he's just gonna like, yeah, let's ride off this giant buffalo into the sunset and fight on into this war, because I don't know what this thing is. Like, to me it just kind of reminds me of the New Mutants, where you ultimately have Demon Bear, and ultimately that's what this thing kind of just reminds me of. But we ultimately have this white buffalo that ends up running into Shadow Moon just for it to disappear. So, and ultimately, I will probably just call it like Demon Buffalo at this point, because I don't know what it is. So, we were ultimately just to basically say at this point that, like, yeah, my consensus on Shadow Moon could quite possibly be correct. That this whole entire time that he is some god of weather or some kind of weather of some sort. And because reasonably consistently we have it to where in the earlier episodes we have Shadow Moon ultimately mentioning about like something about the weather made him feel something, or people were telling him like ultimately to like, hey, think about it raining, think about it snowing, think about it whatever. And so we really have to where it seems like Shadow Moon might quite possibly be like remembering things from a past that he had blocked off, or he had forgotten about, because ultimately, finally, Odin telling Shadow Moon that, "Hey, I'm your daddy," ultimately just made Shadow Moon much more like coherent to what he had not quite figured out in his past of some things here and there, and I thought that that was kind of fascinating. So we have it to where they're having this wake, and we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is to walk off with Odin's fiance, and we ultimately have it to where Odin's fiance ultimately is some kind of technician or has some kind of technical thing going on where ultimately Odin, in the very early episodes, we ultimately had Shadow Moon give Odin a cell phone. He's like, what am I going to use this for? Like, if anything, like, remember when we used to have letters and, and telegrams and, like, remember the good old days? Well, it seems that Odin's fiance is like trying to get messages out to people, like telephone or whatever. And so ultimately, we have it to where Odin's fiance is mentioning it's like, hey, when this hits the fan, ultimately, you can call um, on this number and ultimately, at the very least, get me if you can't get Odin. And ultimately, we have Shadow Moon who is telling her in reverse, it's like, well, it seems like your hubby there is like, it seems like he is just breaking down and he is just like, he is a snowball that eventually is going to uh, smack somewhere down this mountain at some point, and once it does, it's just gonna go everywhere. So, like that's kind of the metaphor that kind of went into my brain of what Shadow Moon was kind of talking about. So, Shadow Moon is ultimately saying like, hey, when this guy like basically explodes, and he will, like if anything, like then you'll have my number, and ultimately if you call my number, then at least you'll get me, kind of thing. So like basically like Shadow Moon and Odin's fiance are basically telling one another like hey, like if all this goes south, then at least we have one another, and at least that's good enough. So Shadow Moon ultimately drives off into the night, because Shadow Moon has a interesting story going on in here, and we'll get to that. So we ultimately find out that seemingly Shadow Moon is going to be quite possibly tied to some murder in this town. It seems that someone had gone missing, and we ultimately have Chad Mulligan that is ultimately going to tie seemingly Shadow Moon to this missing person or this murder of sorts, because ultimately they don't have murder in this town very often. So you ultimately seemingly have it to where also Shadow Moon is having a really, really hard time getting warm in his house. It's called Live in Minnesota, Shadow Moon. Oh, I'm cold. Boo hoo. Living in northern state all the time, Shadow Moon. This is ultimately Wisconsin, so yeah, that's pretty cold, but still. I guess we've never had a man who has lived in a cold climate before, and so he's like, oh my god, I'm so cold. To the point that he absolutely needs to make a fire, even though it says on the fireplace, do not use. Because he's like, you know what? F it. I don't care. I'm going to make a fire and try to get warm. Because we have it to where Shadow Moon's landlady or whatever, her person that he's renting this place out on, who ultimately pulls a shotgun on him and ultimately is asking him all kinds of questions like, where were you? Who are you? When are you? So, because ultimately a person of hers is missing, and so reasonably any guy that otherwise looks like anybody is just gonna get a gun to their face, I guess. So we ultimately have Shadow Moon who ends up renting this place out from her, and we find out that this landlady the entire time had broken the thermostat to ultimately, no matter how much that Shadow Moon had tried to adjust the thermostat, it was never going to get cold, or is never going to get warmer in this environment. So ultimately, we just have Shadow Moon, who is bundling up in some chair somewhere, ultimately trying to stay warm, to the point where he's like, "Dude, I'm gonna make a fire. Like, I'm gonna take an axe and I'm just gonna start chopping wood, because I'm going to get sick. Like, I'm going to get awful. I'm going to just start sneezing and farting on everybody, and it's going to be awful. And I need to be as warm as possible, because ultimately I'm going to fight some god. And if I'm going to get a cold or a flu or a boogadaboo, I'm not going to be at the best match to fight, like, the god of whoever. And so we ultimately have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately cracking some wood and ultimately going in. And as soon as he goes and cracks all this wood, that's when the landlady of his ultimately just tells him, it's like, oh yeah, you know what is per usual when you'd have to do a whole bunch of work for absolutely effing nothing? Well, you were just going to finish cracking all that wood with that axe. Well, I'm just going to fix the thermostat for you, so ultimately you can be warmer. Um, because ultimately, this girl who had pulled a shotgun on him before had apologized for pulling a shotgun, and ultimately then she's like, yeah, I don't think you had any ties to what is going on with this town. Because we ultimately had it to where Chad ultimately pulls Shadow Moon aside and ultimately talks about this murder, or this missing person. I can't still remember which one it is, but I don't think it matters. Either either way, this person is just assumed dead anyways. And so I guess it really doesn't matter, because I'm assuming they will be dead. But anyways, so unless I saw them in the episode and I didn't realize who they were at that point in juncture. But anyways, we have it to where Chad, the sheriff, is ultimately talking to Shadow Moon and saying, like, yeah, this person is missing slash dead something. And so ultimately he's immediately just like, well, you're the new guy in town, so ultimately, like, hey, let me know if you're ever gonna if you're gonna ever leave town, or fly out somewhere, because yeah, we think that you're suspect numero one. Um, and so reasonably, Shadow Moon has to come up with an alibi for when he was gone. And it seems like that alibi eventually will be solid, and ultimately will have Shadow Moon to be cleared. Uh, Luckily, these people don't exactly know that this guy is Shadow Moon, because ultimately he is Michael to them. And so, reasonably, Shadow Moon is still in the clear, because he is otherwise called Michael instead of Shadow Moon. But you would have thought that they would have, like, taken his prints or anything like that if he's under suspicion. Just kind of like, hey, buddy, can we just take your prints, maybe? Can we just like can I just take one print? Like, hey man, are you just gonna drink any coffee so I can take a print? That's an unlawful search. Like, dude, if they're already like suspecting this guy of murder, of the death, of the killing, of the stabbing in the whatever, or the killing of anybody, you would have thought, hey, how about I get a little bit of that juicy fingerprint off the edge, so that way I can let you know that you're actually Shadow Moon, and you're out being a very bad man. So we ultimately have a tour. Shadow Moon is with this lady, and ultimately, yeah, she fixes his thermostat, which ultimately makes him chopping wood a mood point. And otherwise, another yet filler into this episode. Like, God, man, they are just like cranking out the stretching in this one. They're really just like, God, I need just like, could we just have anybody just do like a monotonous project, so that way ultimately it's just uh But yeah, but recently the whole funeral thing is really just how this episode just kind of ends. Or this wake is just really how this episode really does end. But I think that's all I wanted to really just say about this episode. Like, I really felt like this one, like, I didn't think I was going to be able to have 40 minutes worth of talking, let alone maybe even 20. So thank God that ultimately there was enough to talk about. But really, I just had to try to stretch a lot of things because there was absolutely nothing going on in this episode. So I'm gonna get out of here. Ultimately, yeah, this one was just like I'm getting frustrated with this season, and I'm like, where is this season going? Like, there needs to be some kind of like if they're just gonna keep bottling and bottling and bottling episodes to ultimately like in the next episode I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, great, here's a tying to one character and their entire backstory, I bet is gonna be the next episode. So it's like, dude, you guys are stretching so much crap out to just have an entire backstory about another character just be biding you time, because that's what I'm assuming is gonna happen either in the next episode or just the episodes to follow, is that they're just gonna like, yeah, we don't even want to talk about the war anymore because I think people are just getting annoyed about it that ultimately we're not getting to it yet. And so recently now we're just gonna not even like talk about it, and we're just gonna kind of just keep even stretching things out even further to get irrelevant stuff out. So without a doubt, I am gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.